The C-130's searchlight swept across the restless Atlantic, tracing whitecaps that rose and fell like shifting walls. 30-foot seas heaved beneath the plane, each swell rolling out into the dark with a soundless force. Inside, crewmen pressed their faces to the glass, hunting for anything: a flare, a drifting raft, an oil slick. The radios clicked and hissed with grid coordinates, but the replies all came back the same. Nothing. For 10 days the search went on, cutting box patterns across an ocean as large as states on a map. By the end, almost 300,000 square miles had been combed by ships and aircraft. Not a plank, not a life jacket, not a distress call. The SS Poet had vanished. Her story began on October 24, 1980. The 523-foot cargo ship eased away from Philadelphia's Girard Point at midnight, a World War II-era hull reborn in later years as a bulk carrier. She was loaded with over 13,000 tons of No. 2 yellow corn, bound for Port Said, Egypt, as part of the U.S. government's Food for Peace program. 34 men were aboard. Captain Leroy Warren, a veteran mariner, commanded the ship. Among the crew were seasoned sailors and a handful of younger hands, men who had signed on expecting a long but routine transatlantic run. By morning, the Poet had slipped down the Delaware River, past the Capes and into open water. At 9 a.m., she radioed her position off Cape Henlopen, giving course and speed. The message was crisp and ordinary: 15 knots on a straight line toward Gibraltar. Nothing hinted at trouble. That call was the last anyone ever heard from the Poet. Through that weekend, a fast-moving storm clawed its way across the North Atlantic. Winds screamed to 60 knots, driving waves 30 feet high. Vessels in the same region reported rough passages, but they survived. The Poet did not. She never called for help, never flashed a mayday. Her radio was silent. Back in Philadelphia, the families of the crew grew restless as days passed with no word. Wives waited by the phone, parents checked the news, children listened for any clue that the voyage was still unfolding. When the Poet failed to make contact on schedule, the U.S. Coast Guard prepared for the worst. On November 8th, more than 2 weeks after her departure, a massive search began. Air crews flew endless patterns over the ocean, their eyes fixed on gray water below. Coast Guard cutters and Navy vessels joined, scouring the projected route. Merchant ships were warned to keep watch. For a moment, there was hope. A small oil slick reported far offshore, and what looked like an orange life ring spotted from the air. When rescuers returned to the coordinates, both were gone. On November 17th, after exhausting every lead, the search was called off. The Atlantic had yielded nothing. The loss shook Philadelphia deeply. Many of the crew were from the region, and their absence was felt in neighborhoods, at union halls, and in churches where families gathered to hold vigils. In the weeks after the search ended, memorial services were held, names read aloud, candles lit against the dark. At Old Swede's church, voices trembled as each sailor's name was spoken. Some families marked the anniversary in later years by riding the Cape May Lewis ferry and dropping flowers into the water, watching the petals scatter in the wake before vanishing into the sea. The pain of uncertainty never eased. Investigations began quickly. The Coast Guard opened a Marine Board of Investigation. The National Transportation Safety Board reviewed the evidence. Congress asked its own questions. They gathered reports on the weather, cargo records, maintenance logs, and testimony from other mariners who had sailed through the storm. The results frustrated everyone. No firm cause could be named. The official conclusion was that the Poet had likely been overwhelmed by heavy seas, but the precise trigger could not be identified. Without debris or survivors, the case rested on probabilities. Theories narrowed to a handful. Some investigators pointed to structural issues. The Poet had been built during World War II as a troopship and later converted to a freighter. Inspectors in the late 1970s had flagged problems, including a faulty forward hatch cover. If water had forced its way past that cover during the storm, it could have poured into the holds, destabilizing the ship in minutes. Others raised the possibility of synchronous rolling, a deadly phenomenon where a ship's natural roll locks into rhythm with the waves, magnifying each swing until the vessel capsizes. Another suggestion was catastrophic hull failure, steel stressed by decades of service finally giving way under relentless pounding seas. Each scenario ended the same way, with a sudden loss and no time for a distress call. The silence of the radios remains the most haunting detail. In most maritime disasters, even seconds are enough for a frantic mayday. The Poet sent nothing. That silence fueled speculation in Philadelphia and beyond. Some argued the search began too late or in the wrong area. Others whispered about hijacking, piracy, or even secret military missions. No evidence ever supported those claims. The official record stayed grounded. The ship sailed into heavy weather and never emerged. For the families, the lack of answers was devastating. Insurance claims and official papers declared the men missing, presumed dead. Benefits were processed, but no one could tell the mothers, wives, and children why it had happened. They were left to imagine the final moments, whether the crew had time to gather, whether they had fought to launch lifeboats, whether the sea had ended it too quickly for anyone to act. The questions lingered long after investigators filed their final reports. The disappearance of the Poet stands out not just for the loss of 34 lives, but because the ocean gave nothing back. A ship more than 500 feet long, a steel hull with thousands of tons of cargo, vanished without debris. The Atlantic has taken many ships, but in an age of radios and satellites, such a clean erasure is rare and chilling. Mariners still speak of it with unease, noting that a vessel of her size should have left some trace. That she did not remains one of the great maritime mysteries of the late 20th century. The Poet's last moments will never be known. What remains are the rhythms of her departure, the tugboats pulling away, the pilot boat turning back toward shore, the ship sliding past the jetties into open water. Routine, familiar, almost ordinary. Her final radio call reported only position, course, and speed. Somewhere east of Delaware Bay, in the grip of a violent storm, something happened fast enough and final enough to erase her entirely. More than 4 decades later, the Atlantic still holds its silence. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.